All right, welcome to The Explainer. You know, some stories sound like they're straight out of a wild sci-fi movie. This is one of them. But what's crazy is that for a little while, this was a very, very real plan. And it wasn't dreamed up by some Hollywood writer, but by the US military itself.
So to really get this, you have to transport yourself back to 1958. Imagine this. The Cold War is at its peak. Suddenly, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1. It's just this little beeping metal ball circling the planet, but it causes absolute panic here in the US. It felt like America was suddenly drastically behind in the biggest race of the century. The pressure to make a big, bold statement, it was immense.
So they asked this question, and no, this wasn't some writer's room brainstorming session. This was the actual, jaw-dropping idea behind a top-secret government project. The whole point was to show off America's power in a way that was, well, let's be honest, completely spectacular and absolutely terrifying.
Yep, this is the story of Project A119. And we're going to get into all of it. How this insane idea even came up, who was on the team, and trust me, there's a name in there that's going to surprise you, and maybe most importantly, why we can still look up at the moon today without a giant crater in it.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, the plan itself. Then we'll look at how the space race really heated things up. We'll get inside Project A119, talk about a possible race to detonate, and then cover why the whole thing was scrapped. And finally, how this massive secret eventually got out.
Okay, first up, the plan to nuke the moon. You know, for a project this dramatic, they gave it the most boring, bureaucratic name they could think of. A study of lunar research flights. I mean, seriously, it sounds like a college research paper, not a plan to blow up a chunk of the moon.
But why? Why would anyone even think of doing this? Well, it really all boils down to the intense pressure of the space race. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, it wasn't just a hooray for science moment. Here in the US, it was seen as a massive threat. I mean, you had this Soviet satellite flying right over American heads. It was a symbol, a terrifying reminder that they might be able to dominate us from space.
And just look at how fast things moved. The Sputnik crisis kicks off in October 1957. By May of '58, that's just 7 months later. The Air Force is already starting Project A119. This tells you it wasn't some carefully thought-out long-term plan. Nope, this was a panicked, we need to do something big right now kind of reaction.
All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Who was behind this? What exactly was the plan? And what kind of bomb were they going to use?
Okay, so Project A119 was this top-secret plan to nuke the moon. And yeah, the official reports mentioned scientific and military reasons, but let's call it what it was, a political power play. It was basically the biggest, most aggressive PR stunt ever imagined, designed to boost morale at home and send a very loud, very clear message to the Soviet Union.
And the plan itself was, well, it was kind of brilliant in a completely terrifying way. The idea was to aim for the moon's terminator line. That's the fuzzy edge between the light side and the dark side. Why there? Because if you set off the nuke right there, the sun would catch the dust cloud just right. It would light it up, creating a massive visible explosion that people could literally see from Earth with their own eyes. A mushroom cloud on the moon?
Now, they couldn't just launch a massive H-bomb. The rockets back then just weren't powerful enough. So they chose a smaller, lighter weapon called the W-25 warhead. And you can see here, compared to the little boy bomb from Hiroshima, it was a lot smaller. But don't let that fool you. 1.7 kilotons is still a seriously powerful nuclear blast. And the key thing was, it was light enough to actually make the trip to the moon.
And you might be picturing some rogue general in a smoke-filled room, but the team was actually led by a respected physicist, Dr. Leonard Riefel. And they hired some of the brightest minds, including this one young doctoral student. His job was super important. He had to do the math to figure out if the dust cloud would even be visible from Earth. And that student's name was Carl Sagan. Yes, that Carl Sagan. This was years, of course, before he became one of the world's most famous scientists and a huge critic of nuclear weapons. Kind of wild, right?
But that's not all. There was another big reason for the rush, a deep-seated fear that the Soviets were going to beat them to it. Yep, there were all these rumors swirling around that the USSR had the exact same idea and was about to pull the trigger.
Newspapers started printing stories, quoting these anonymous sources, saying the Soviets were planning to set off a hydrogen bomb on the moon to mark the anniversary of the October Revolution. Now, at the time, nobody could confirm it, but just the rumor was enough to add a ton of pressure and light a fire under the American project.
And here's the craziest part. The rumors were actually true. It took until after the Cold War ended for us to find out, but yeah, the Soviets had their own plan, code-named E4. They started it in the same year, and they even canceled it for pretty much the same safety concerns. It's just a perfect, chilling example of how both sides were thinking along the exact same terrifying lines.
So this all leads to the big question, right? With all this momentum, all this pressure, why did they suddenly pull the plug in January 1959? The project didn't even last a full year.
Well, thankfully, someone hit the brakes, for a few pretty solid reasons. First, they started to worry about the public reaction. People might not love the idea of nuking the moon. But the biggest reason? The risk. Rockets in the 1950s weren't exactly reliable. And if that rocket failed on launch, it wouldn't just be an embarrassment. It could fall right back down to Earth and, well, you get the picture. Nuking your own country is not a good look. So they realized that actually landing a man on the moon would be a much more powerful and way, way safer win.
But just because the project was canceled doesn't mean the story ends there. Oh no. The files were locked away, the reports were destroyed, and the whole thing was buried so deep it stayed a secret for almost 40 years.
So how did it finally come out? Well, in a really ironic twist, it was because of Carl Sagan, even after he had passed away. See, in 1999, his biographer was digging through old papers and found a fellowship application from way back in 1959. On it, Sagan had listed the titles of 2 classified reports he'd worked on. That was the clue. That little breadcrumb led the biographer to the project's leader, Leonard Reifel, who, in the year 2000, finally came forward and told the whole unbelievable story.
And this quote from Dr. David Lowery, a nuclear historian, really just nails it. He called the plan obscene. And think about it. If they had gone through with it, our memory of reaching for the stars wouldn't be Neil Armstrong's one giant leap for mankind. It would have been a mushroom cloud. Our first major interaction with another world would have been an act of violence. It really would have changed everything.
So in the end, Project A119 is this wild footnote from the Cold War. It's a pretty stark reminder of how fear and intense competition can drive people to consider the unthinkable. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kinds of extreme ideas are being kicked around in secret right now?